So you face a choice like, is it fundamentally a bad thing to be a person? Or is our account of a person as someone who's independent and autonomous fundamentally untrue? And we have to make room for our genuine neediness in our account of what it means to be human and what we owe to each other.
In today's episode, we have Leah Libresco Sargeant as our guest. She is an author, freelance writer, and speaker. She also works in family policy and previously worked in campus ministry. She now lives in Maryland with her husband and children. And we initially invited her on to talk about her book called Building the Benedict Option, a guide to building thicker Christian community, because we were really excited to have more conversations about how we practically in our lives, wherever we're at, build just more real community. But has wonderfully dovetailed into her most recent book called Dignity of Dependence, a feminist manifesto, arguing that women's equality with men doesn't depend on the interchangeability of the sexes. It's really fascinating to see this connection between community building and dependence, because so much of the friction of actually becoming community is learning to be dependent on one another. So I'm excited to have Leah Libresco Sargeant as a guest today, and I trust that you will all be delighted in hearing from her. We did have some audio glitches on our call, especially at the beginning of the episode, so sorry about that. Hang with it though. It is worth it. She articulates so many poignant thoughts, and I really want everybody to hear. In fact, we like the work that she's done so much that New Kinship Podcast is giving away 2 free copies of her most recent book, The Dignity of Dependence, for subscribers who find us on Substack or Instagram in the next week. You can find the details about the giveaways in the show notes. So hello and welcome, listeners, to another episode of New Kinship, one that I've been really looking forward to for honestly over a year before I even reached out to Leah. I was looking forward to the day and have had so many different topics that I'd be like, man, it'd be so great to have Leah on to talk about. In case this is your first episode, because you already know Leah, but maybe you don't know us, this is David Frank, one of the co-hosts of New Kinship, and I'm here with TJ.
Hello, everyone.
So yeah, Leah Libresco Sargeant is an author of 2 different books and has done quite a wide span of different work over your years. And last year you actually came to Minnesota and joined us for a local conference. And yeah, I wish when you came up, you were speaking around kind of a anthropology and theological reflections on womanhood and gender. And I wish I had given a little bit of a intro at the beginning to the audience, because a lot of them came in thinking around topics on transgenderism. And part of what I was hoping that people would get was like, we can't really think well about transgenderism if we can't first think well about gender. And I felt like a lot of your work has been doing that in very concrete ways. Anyways, so Leah, could you share a little bit more about yourself, where you're from, important people in your life, what you care about, etc.?
Sure. I'm Leah Sargeant. I grew up on Long Island. I went to college. I joined a debate group. I fought with the most interesting wrong people I could find. We became friends, and eventually I became Catholic. And I've held a lot of different kinds of jobs. As you say, I've been a journalist, a policy wonk. That's what I do now on family policy, work history. And I live in Maryland with my husband and our 3 kids. And my new book, The Dignity of Dependence, is coming out this fall.
Sweet, sweet. So this is the second book, is that correct? That you've written?
Third book. Third book.
Oh.
So it's Arriving at Amen, which is about my conversion and learning to pray after becoming a Christian, but then needing to learn how to live as a Christian. Building the Benedict Option, which is about building thicker Christian community wherever you are in the next 2 weeks to 2 months. There's none of that, well, I can have these good things after I get a new job, after we get married, after the kids pick up after themselves. It's no, where you are right now, what can you do? And the newest one, The Dignity of Dependence, is about how to advocate for women as women in a world that often treats us like defective men. And obviously this progression, arriving at Amen, building the Benedict Option, and atheist dignity, raises the question, including for me, what was the secret C alliterative book that I should have written but skipped?
I'll be thinking about a potential answer to that question. Okay, so could you tell us more about your second book? What led to you writing Building the Benedict Option?
Yeah, so when I converted to Christianity, in many ways it was like a flare gun went off. People went like, "Well, we've got to help Leah, right? She is like a baby fawn wobbling around on her little legs, like she doesn't know what to do." And that was true. And so I was really lucky in that my deepening relationship with God, which had always been a relationship from his side, now I was had the opportunity to acknowledge and return his love, that growing relationship with God happened in concert with these deepening friendships with other Christians who wanted to show me, well, this is my favorite saint. Oh, have you done this prayer? Do you want to come to this concert? Do you want to come to eat dinner with me? And this is the prayer we do before dinner, right? So you get to knit together that vertical love of you and God and that horizontal love of you and God's people. Really lucky in that. But I'm not the only person who needs it. And I think often people go through a life transition like graduating from college, moving to a new city. And of course they carry with them that vertical relationship, but the whole horizontal relationship of being a Christian among other Christians fades away or gets broken. And so my focus was there's a book that had already was kind of in the offing when I wrote mine. That's Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option, where he's really making the case for Christian community is important. My book says, I bet if you're picking up this book, you already believe it. I don't need to pitch you on community being important. You're sold. My book is meant as a practical handbook where you'll read, a chapter or two in, you'll put the book down, face down on your coffee table, and you'll call someone and invite them over. And I'll give you tools for hosting more people than you might feel comfortable with initially, for figuring out how to tell someone you want to hang out with them without feeling so awkward that then you're telling them you care about them, right? And ways to kind of bring prayer into your ordinary daily gatherings rather than thinking of it as something that's reserved for church and privately by yourself.
Mm. Could you share about what those community building efforts have looked like in your life since writing the book? Successes, failures, anything else learned?
So one of the two questions I kind of give people reading the book that I think help you find what's the right deeper into community for you, right? Are what do you do alone that you could do with others? And what do you do in private that you could do in public? Um, and that really gives you the opportunity to start with what you love and make that the basis of what you're sharing. So, one thing my husband and I have done and continue to do, even with kids, all of whom are 5 and under, by the way, is we do liturgical poetry gatherings. I talk a little in the book that sometimes it's easier to get together with people for like a show and tell event, but for grown-ups. So we've done it at Christmas, during Lent, Advent, Pentecost, where there will be a major moment in the seasons of the prayer. And we'll say, okay, welcome to our house. We're going to have cake. Everyone bring over, optionally, but strongly encouraged, a poem about Christmas or a poem about Pentecost, whatever that means to you, whether that's one about renewal, about purgation, about fire, about the movements of the Holy Spirit. Just bring us a poem that you like that feels like it's a reasonable poem to read at a Pentecost poetry party. And what I like doing about this is, first of all, I think it's harder even than when I wrote the book for people to get over a little bit of friction about, am I allowed to have this kind of gathering? Will people say yes? Like, how am I justifying doing this? And I often find it's easier to justify when you're holding a one-off calendar-based event. If I invite you, David, over to my house next week, and I say, do you want to come over for dinner on Wednesday? You can go like, oh, let me think. Like, what do I do? How often do I want to go out? And I go, David, do you want to come over for dinner on Wednesday? It's the feast of St. Augustine, and we're going to have poached pears for dessert, to celebrate the feast. Like, suddenly, I either say yes to Leah or I have to wait till next year for it to be the feast of St. Augustine again. And, this is me being tricky, right? Because I can always pick a feast day, and I always do. But it helps people who might feel like, well, is this worth it for me or for them? Just get over that little bit of reluctance. You just give something a little bit of a name, and suddenly it does sound more important. So it is the Pentecost poetry party. That sounds official and important, and maybe I should come. But the barrier to coming is very low. And when we do it, then we do have the opportunity to kind of focus all of our time together, make the central point of that something that is beautiful and good versus, oh, well, here we are, so let's all tell each other what our jobs are again. And then what's best of all for me is my job as a Christian is to look at other people and love them and see what Christ is doing in their life. It's technically something that's always available to me, but I find it harder when I know them less well or less deeply. And so when I ask someone at kind of with any provocation, bring something beautiful that you love to my house and show it to me, I always find it easier to love them because I'm seeing more of the love that God has placed in their heart, what animates them, what they're drawn towards, not just what you do for work, how long have you lived here. And then by the end of the afternoon, when we pray together, we ask people for prayer requests. I think everyone finds it more natural to bring up prayer requests that are really on their heart because suddenly they've seen all these people as people who are moved by beauty, right? People who parts of God's salvation story catch their eye in different ways. And so I'm really grateful for that kind of gathering because I can meet a friend of a friend and really love them at the end of it versus go, it's nice broadly that that person was here, I guess.
I really love the focus on starting just where our own loves are because, yeah, we can be afraid to be quirky or be like, what if people don't love what I love? But how, if we can't be ready to love them as they are, it probably starts with us being honest about where our own loves are and just being ready to share that. And they can say no if they don't have to come.
And I think that's again where people should feel they have a lot of freedom as an individual versus running ministries for your church, your parish, etc. I think it's harder if you're in charge of all activities for your church, thinking like, well, if I run this weird event, will people feel excluded that they didn't want to do a poetry event or they didn't want to see this movie? You can face the temptation to go, well, what's the broadest, most inoffensive thing, which has the caveat it won't be sharply attractive to anyone when you pick the broadest thing to do. But as an individual, it's not your job to serve the whole parish. Like you have the opportunity to say, I want to do things I really love that will attract people who like this weird, beautiful, particular thing. And, because God tells us that like the eye is not the hand, is not the foot, I might be able to best serve God and live into community by really leaning into something that moves me rather than saying, how can I do something that is blandly attractive to everyone and no one will dislike?
So how many years has it been since you wrote Building the Benedict Option?
I think it's been about 10 now.
Okay. How would you say, has your vision for life and Christian community building changed since you've written it?
Well, parts of my life have changed, right? So that's why I really framed the handbook as here's a good set of strategies to figure out what in your life like is alive that you want to share with other people and what gifts you might have to make that offer to others rather than here are my Leah's preferred parties and why you should throw them. I think for us, obviously moving into the season of our life where we have young kids, that big question is, how do we balance things we want to do with grown-ups and how kids are incorporated into that or not? And when we do something like a poetry party, we really just like dump magnet tiles all over the floor and we're reading poems above the kids and the people bring their kids over and that makes it easy for people to attend. It's not a fancy party and there are moments where you have to pause a poem to say, please stop hitting someone with that block, or, oh, I guess you really want a snack, or it appears you have had an accident, let's go clean up, right? So we make all the choices to prioritize that over a smooth, seamless party, because if we had that kind, our other friends who had kids couldn't come. And on the kind of occasions where we really do want to do something that doesn't include all of our kids. So I really love the play Equivocation, which is written by a Jesuit priest. And it's about William Shakespeare being asked to write a history play of the gunpowder plot. It's very funny. It's very thoughtful about what it means to tell the truth in hard times. But it is kind of sweary. I don't want to read it with all the kids in the house. So in that case, we hired a couple babysitters, and part of what being hospitable meant was having two babysitters who were watching all the kids on our back porch with, chalk and everything else and thinking, okay, how do we make this a hospitable event to our friends with kids? And does that mean including them or finding something for them to do, but not asking people routinely to pay for a babysitter to spend time with us? I think in the same way a little bit about when we bought our house, we had to think about, okay, how will this house serve us to be hospitable to our parents or like anyone else who will going to have more mobility issues over time? And it's not an ideal house for that. It has a very small step up to the front, which isn't the worst thing, but it has no first floor bathroom. So, we thought it out and we were like, okay, well, there is a 0-step entrance in back and you can get around with no step to the back. So, in buying this house, we're making the choice that when we have people over who can't do stairs, they might need a little help to get to the basement and get to the easy bathroom there. And if we move, that I think will be the first thing we change, right? But kind of looking at who am I making welcome? What am I asking of them to be included? And can I ease that wherever possible?
So you stand behind what you wrote 10 years ago. There aren't any parts you'd want to tweak because you kept it strategic.
I mean, I think this is the trick of generative rules, not a prescribed system of events. I think the biggest thing that isn't in the book is more of a post-COVID. So you've fallen out of the habit of these things, or you had a big thing you belonged to and it's kind of lost its animating spirit. What do you do now? And, I think the answer is you start something new that's well suited for where you are now. But that is really hard. And I think it's good for people to talk more openly right now than they might have felt empowered to before of just, I don't love the post-COVID equilibrium we've landed on for social life. Do you not like it too? Do you want to sit down with me and think about what do we two want to plan together?
How do you think about building neighborhood or building community in neighborhoods? Yeah, what's that look like?
I think the big challenge is how are you visible to your neighbors and how are they visible to you? A church can be a logical place where you encounter each other, especially if your church really does serve a distinct neighborhood. People aren't driving from 30 minutes away in all directions. And then you want the chance to linger and encounter each other. My parish does donuts after church, which is the donuts aren't really the point, except for the kids for whom they're very important. They're small donuts, they're fine. They're cut up into pieces to go further, but it means there's a reason to go down into the basement. And once you're there, you linger, you encounter other people. You have conversations, you hear prayer requests you wouldn't have heard any other time. And I think you could go even further than that. So I would love it, and maybe I'll suggest it this year, that if in the winter our parish put up, a big poster board that said, put your name up here, and what street you live on, if you're going to have trouble shoveling out in a snowstorm. And then we'll circulate that list to the young boys of the neighborhood and being clear, like, these are people who would have trouble. And we expect the young men of the parish to go do this for free, right? That's part of what it means to be a parish that takes care of each other. Because I think the challenge is it's nice to spend time with each other, but you can often find that you spend time with someone and don't hear the most important thing on their heart, or the biggest thing they genuinely want to say to you or need to say to someone by default. That's why I always try when I'm with another Christian not to part without asking, what can I pray for you? Because it's often the case for me that I can spend an hour or two hanging out with someone and not hear that their mom is in the hospital till that last moment when I ask about prayer, not just, so what's going on? What are you doing? It takes a real moment of pause for that intimacy.
Thanks so much. Yeah, building local community is such a strong passion of mine, and I'm a little envious of the parish norms that exist more in the Catholic Church, though I know we're all kind of still a little bit driven by, well, I have a car and maybe I could drive a little bit further to a liturgical style that, I like a little bit more, and not always contemplating how those miles add up in our relationships and how it creates friction for things like, yeah, we can go around and shovel the driveways of those who need it in a way that makes a bit more sense. So it's my hope to live into that more and more as the years come by. Tita, do you have anything further you want to dig into on building the Benedict option?
I'm curious how you would think that the Catholic Church in particular has resources to produce this sort of community. But I ask that question not knowing if you have much experience in other Christian communities to compare. But I am curious on that question.
Yeah, I've only ever been an atheist or a Catholic, so I can speak only so much comparatively. But I think two things that are very helpful for the church are, one, mass attendance is obligatory. So there's much a question. Obviously, not everyone does it, unfortunately, but there really is some sense of everyone in the world ought to be here on Sunday. This is not, well, what am I getting out of it? Or is it a good pastor, right? It's just, we have Christ here in the bread and the wine, and you're obliged to come, and that's enough, right? I think that's helpful. I also say that it's going to Catholic church on Sunday that I see the most people unlike myself, not just in terms of age. So that's a big part. When I was a young 20-something in DC, Ava and I worked with were people mostly like me. I went to events with people mostly like me, and I saw genuinely much older people like only there. And I only was chatting with them at coffee hour or adult Sunday school afterwards. So I didn't have a sustained conversation with someone over 60, over 70, except at church. And similarly, in Catholic churches in particular, that's where you have that most small c Catholic, everybody is here with regards to disability, right? Just simply because Catholics, especially regular mass-going Catholics, do not abort their children for reasons of disability. It was at church and nowhere else that I met kids with Down syndrome, kids who had skull fusion problems, etc., where I've been able to sustain a friendship over many years with some of those families, and then know these people as individuals and not as particular diagnoses. And I think that's a core part of community, that part of what you do, and this is fine, is like set up a flare for people like yourself, not necessarily an age or race, but it's just like, I love this piece of art. I love this way of thinking, come with me and let's think together. And that's good. But then you want all those little islands to be joined up into an archipelago, and that's at church, where it's like, all right, and even if we have no interests in common, we are looking towards the same person, Christ, and we're doing that here.
Could I also ask, has Rod Dreher ever engaged your text, kind of subsequent to its publishing? And what has that been like? Yeah?
Yeah, no, he's been lovely about it. He called me the den mother of the Benedict option, and I really appreciate that he's highlighted a number of different communities they're trying to live into with this. And, my big emphasis is you don't have to move to a neighborhood where everyone is doing this. So that is nice, right? Even if you are kind of starting this yourself, there are ways that are sustainable for you to make an invitation to others. And then you can see what they ask you to do in return.
Mm-hmm.
I think some people came out of the original book thinking, okay, so the point is specific communities, and my Ben-Op life will start when I move to one of them. And, my big emphasis kind of all the time is your real life is right now. You could even close on a house in a very Ben-Op community and then get hit by a car like the day before you move, because God meant for your whole real life to be here and now where you are. So you can never, as a Christian, think the important part of my life, the grace-filled part of my life, the purposeful part of my life is gated beyond a job, a move, a birth, right? This is your real life, and it's sufficient to be a saint.
I have 2 more questions. First, can you just give an example? You mentioned both the kind of doing what you already do and inviting others into it, but also, is there something you do in private that you could do in public? Can you give an example of that second thing?
Yeah, I'm going to give not specifically about community, but which I think kind of illustrates the broader point, which is I used to run monthly debates at my house in DC. So I was living in Chinatown in the kind of the heart of downtown. I'd invite friends over for a debate with a gavel and with a themed dessert. You're not obliged to do themed desserts to host events, but it was fun for me and fun for people coming. And when the weather was good, it was a huge apartment building. We'd go up on the roof where there's kind of a lot of different places with couches and have a debate up there. And one of the times we're up there, a woman comes over and sees us setting up, like probably sees the gavel, and is like, "Are you the group that's having debates on the roof up here?" And I'm like, "Yes." And I assumed the next thing that she was going to say is like, "Please don't do that. Like, it's disruptive to other people using the roof." And it was a large roof, but like, who knows, right? And she goes like, "Would it be okay if my son sat nearby so he could listen?" And he's a like 13 or 14-year-old homeschooler. I was like, no, like he can't just sit nearby so he can listen. Like he can come sit with us. He doesn't have to eavesdrop. He can just sit with the whole group. And if he wants to give a speech, he can give a speech. And so, he did come. And then I exchanged emails with the mom. So he started coming to my apartment every month, which was great. Because again, first of all, there we all were, like early 20-something-year-olds. And then suddenly there was someone different from us at the event. And the swearing went down, which I was very happy about. But you kind of have to think, okay, if I just held the debates in my living room, how much am I asking of the Holy Spirit to bring this boy into our lives? It's not impossible for God, but it's a lot weirder. Like, he's got to get off on the wrong elevator floor by mistake going to his house and then make a mistake, knock, but then just be so enraptured right in the moment that he decides he wants to be part of it. Like, God can do all those things. But it's also my job to not ask this much of the Holy Spirit to have community, not ask for a miracle to meet people in my own building who might want to do something with me. I think moving in public is a big gift for that. I think some of the people who do this all the time are folks who are consecrated religious, who wear habits, priests and clericals, where to some extent they are just being a person who is a Christian, which many of us are in private, publicly all the time. And they can be surprised, or after a time less surprised by what that brings out. I've had this in a much smaller way, but some of that private versus public for me is just as simple as if I want to pray the rosary on the MTA, praying it with the actual beads rather than counting discreetly on my fingers. And most of the time I do that, nothing happens. And when I lived in New York, you are never the weirdest thing on the subway. You don't need to worry about praying on the subway. But one of the times I did it, someone said, "Is that a rosary?" And I'm like, "Yes." He's like, "Are you praying?" And I'm like, "Yes." He goes, "Would you pray for me?" Because his cancer looked like it was coming out of remission. So I think that's really the reason to think about moving from private to public, both for kind of joyful, rowdy things you might want to invite someone into, and just making yourself visible as a Christian, because every day you will meet someone who wishes that someone would pray for them or with them. You just don't know who that person is, and they don't know that you're willing to say yes unless you take an extra step.
Really? It's beautiful. My last question on building the Benedict option is, so I live in an intentional Christian community house, and some of the questions that communities have been thinking about is onto the sustainability of it. And there have been some communities that have been going for decades, and so they're doing the practical troubleshooting of how to integrate the seniors, who are continuing in the ability and disability questions really beautifully. And some of these communities, some of it's just on the, are people actually wanting to stick around? Do I have the emotional energy to keep restarting? And what I both love about your work is just saying, wherever you're at, just pick something that you can do. As you are 10 years post this, has this cultivation generated community and partnerships so that it's feels like it's growing, there's a larger foundation and network? Or does it feel like, well, it's okay that I'm at day one again, and I might always be at day one of just starting something new?
I think you're all spend a substantial time in days you can offer range. You can say okay, this is the kind of thing I want to do. This is what I want to invite people over for. And now you do move and your house is poorly suited to big gatherings, or it's so out of the way people genuinely don't want to come. So you decide, all right, am I someone who's going to do more visiting now than hosting? Am I going to look for parks or reasons to get together somewhere where everyone can meet? But now I'm giving up the pleasure of hosting at my house because it genuinely doesn't work for my friends, right? Again, as someone who went from hoping to actually having kids, I spend a lot more time, asking for things or receiving from all than I did. And I've had to give up a little bit that some of my pleasure of hosting is cooking. I still get to do it, but when I have my 3 kids who are medium-ranged picky eaters, and then I invite over a bunch more kids, at a certain point, sometimes it is, the thing that would give me the greatest pleasure personally when hosting you is to cook something really cool that everyone likes and I like putting the time into. But given what actually best serves all our families, we're ordering pizza. And there may be a season of my life, again, I hope, where I can cook an interesting dish that everyone at the table will be interested in eating. But I don't want to make that genuine good an obstruction or a disappointment to sharing time with friends. I think for other people that hang up is more, how clean does my house have to be to have people over? If you can't hit what you think an ideal method of spending time together would be, is it still okay to invite people over when there are toys all over your floor? And for me, that's never been a problem. There will never be a time when all the floors are clean at once. So I simply know if I want to have people over, it has to be okay that they come to a messy house.
I wanted to know if we could move to talk about your third book, The Dignity of Dependence. As of now, as we record this, I believe it's coming out next month. Is that correct?
October 1st.
October 1st. Okay. So what can you first kind of describe this book in general? And what would our listeners need to know as they start to think about engaging this text in particular?
So I think the core claim of my book is that you can't build a good society on the foundation of a false anthropology. Now, what does that mean in practice? You can't be just to other people when you're not telling the truth about what people are. And I think what we have in our society is a big assumption that what it means to be truly human, fully human, is to not need other people. That we have periods of our life, obviously, where we do need other people. As I said, all my kids are 5 and under. None of them are autonomous human beings. 2 of them cannot adequately clean up their own poos, right? But we kind of treat that as a rounding error. Well, people grow out of it. People are children, which is kind of partly human, and then they become fully human. And we vary in terms of how much we kind of allow someone's need to degrade our sense of their personhood, right? In the womb, the fact that a child needs its mother is taken as a reason it might be licit to kill that child. And we're seeing increasingly at the end of life that when people become old, become disabled, need more help in the same way they did at the beginning of their life, will tolerate diaper changing from a baby. But increasingly, the fact that an adult might need help changing their diapers might be a reason, especially more and more in Canada, why they might be a licit target for killing. The argument of my book is that we treat these bits of life as exceptional, but the pattern of our lives is needing others. The only thing that changes over time is how acutely we need someone and how much that need is concentrated on a particular person, the way a baby in the womb can only be cared for in this particular way by his or her mother, versus someone who's very old could rely on a wide range of people. The question is, who is going to step into that gap? But when we frame our real lives as kind of these brief periods where we're able-bodied, where we're not pregnant, where our parents are not in care, right? You actually kind of look at that timeline and say, okay, well, which parts am I punching out? Well, infancy, that's not real life. The last maybe 2 or 3 years of my life, that's not real life. That bit where I was pregnant, well, that wasn't real life. Where I was nursing, that wasn't real life. When my dad was in hospice, that's not real life because it asked so much of me. It warped my life around his needs. You go hang on. Suddenly this timeline of what it means to be a person is maybe, a couple dots and stripes. It looks like a bit of Morse code, I guess, right? And even for men who I think have an easier time living within this lie of autonomy, not indefinitely, but for a bit, there's not much real life left for them either. So you face a choice is it fundamentally a bad thing to be a person? Or is our account of a person as someone who's independent and autonomous fundamentally untrue? And we have to make room for our genuine neediness in our account of what it means to be human and what we owe to each other.
I looked a little bit at your book before we started our talk, and it really hit me, this personalist element that you're talking about. I have a social scientist that I'm kind of a fan of named Christian Smith, who's a sociologist at Notre Dame. And in the past decade or so, he's been working on a type of personalism. And I was like, oh, Leah's also moving into this personalist venue with this text. So I was curious if you could comment on that. And maybe are there other sources that you were drawing on in particular to develop the argument, develop the text in general?
Yeah, I'll say three people I particularly admire here are Gilbert Mailander, the bioethicist, who wrote this beautiful essay in First Things called "I Want to Burden My Family." That this is what love looks like. That as a human person who has needs, part of the shape love takes is other people answering those needs, including the needs that are embarrassing. We can kind of measure our loves by how much people are willing to accompany us in the hard parts of our life, not just the pleasant jocular parts. I love Alistair McIntyre, not just after Virtue, but he really has written on disability as a way of how do we know each other? Independent rational animals in other places of just the measure of what it means to be a human society is how we care for people who cannot care for themselves. And I love the work of Sarah Hendren, who's a disability scholar. She wrote, What Can a Body Do? That's about the different ways we meet the world in and through our bodies and the different tools we design that are either about sort of rounding bodies to the normal, right? Where it's like, okay, if you, just the example of someone who's very short, like if you're very short and you can't reach a podium, is our goal to give you a really, really high box? Or to, in this case, her design students help build a collapsible podium that this woman can take with her on speaking gigs so she has something proportionate to herself, right? And this question of how do we meet this individual, not as someone who's falling short of what it means to be a real person because she is literally too short. So we have to make her look more normal and say, okay, well, what are your particular needs in the body God has given you? And how can we answer them? I think part of the challenge in the secular world is assuming God has done a good thing in making each person. That's not a foundational assumption in our society. But I do frame a lot of this through just the brute reality of our need, because I think that's something you can share even if you don't agree on the author of humanity. You can say, okay, I guess as we talk through these examples, it is true that people mostly need each other a lot of the time. So what are we going to do about it?
Can we also, we comment on what do you think in the past produced this antipathy towards dependency? So you're talking about the argument, but what is kind of the historical chain or historical narrative that you are describing that produced kind of the situation we're in so that your intervention is now needed?
So I think it's important to remember this has been a tension throughout human history, right? That one of the earliest things that was said of Christians was, I love the phrase, like they share their meals, but not their wives, and they do not expose their children. That this was shocking for the Romans, that you might have a child who is excess, who is disabled, where the natural thing to do for the Romans, not a controversial thing, the natural obligatory thing is to get rid of a baby who feels like they're not worth it. Whether because you have enough already, they're the wrong sex, they're disabled. And that Christians did not do this, and it was shocking. So I think, it's not that the world is now much worse than it's ever been before. It's that we've oscillated, right? That we went from a pagan culture that didn't see all humans as intrinsically valuable, as equal in dignity, even though different in capacity. We moved into a Christian world that did strongly make that genuinely controversial claim. And where we are now, it's kind of a case where the claim still echoes, but the foundation for it is gone. We have a post-Christian society that holds on to a lot of Christian views, but doesn't acknowledge them as particularly Christian views or based on a Christian account of the human person. So you will definitely find people who say, look, everyone is equal, you have to be fair to everyone, but can't quite articulate what that equality is based in. And that's where then you get to a point where they go, well, everyone is equal, everyone is important. But if you're really old, like you're not really you anymore. Somehow your you-ness has gone away. So you're just a body, not a person. And I think this is why the book is subtitled A Feminist Manifesto, because I think one of the ways you see that gap between having some Christian, conclusions in the culture without the actual reasoning there to support them. I think most people believe correctly that men and women are equal in dignity. You'll find some people who loudly dissent, but for the most part, and especially in the way they carry out their ordinary lives, people act as though men and women are both people in like a very meaningful sense. And you should encounter a man or woman and love them in a similar way as a fellow human being. But why is that true is the question. And one of the threads in the book is, I think, a lot of claims about the equality of men and women in a secular society feel like they hinge on the interchangeability of men and women. Because after all, that's kind of the simplest proof of equality. If I have two things and I can swap out one for the other, they must be equivalent and therefore equal, and I'm allowed to treat them the same. I get this real touchiness or fear about anything that exposes an asymmetry between men and women. You see this really particularly in the question of women's fertility, the ability to bear a child. But you even see it in just debates about men and women's sports. Are there fundamental differences between men and women on average such that even a world-class female athlete probably can't outrun, a college medium competitive male sprinter? Yes. People get defensive about this because it feels like if I concede that non-Olympic level men can outrace Olympic level women, have I in some sense conceded that women are worse than men? No, like I haven't. But that's because I don't think women's equality with men depends on whether we can beat them in the same races or, do everything physically a man can do or not do physically things that men can't do when it comes to bearing a child. I think my dignity as a woman comes from the fact simply that I am a human being and that I'm made in the image of God, and God wanted both men and women. So that's a lot easier for me. And there are a lot of facts out in the world that aren't threatening to me. But I think when you kind of overhear or participate in these conversations, you'll see this allergy to anything that does make men and women different, whether it is those physical capacities or even the temptation to trivialize pregnancy. Because if pregnancy really does make things harder for women in certain ways, then maybe men and women can't be equal.
In your conception of dependence, do you think dependence relies on hierarchy? Does there have to be hierarchical relationship in order for something to be dependent on another thing, or often it's like that, or is that not necessary in the way you're thinking about it?
I think there's one really obvious and important hierarchical relationship for Christians, and it's between us and God, right? That is not a symmetrical or peer relationship. I am always dependent on God, whether I'm well, whether I'm sick, whether I'm young, whether I'm old, because he conserves me in existence moment to moment. He loves me into being, and every moment that I am, it's because he is saying, I want you to be. And that's not a love I can return in kind. I can return love to God, but even the love I return is love gifted to me by God to return to him. So, I think part of the reason it's a big problem for people to be so uncomfortable with relationships of dependence horizontally is if we catechize each other into thinking that needing someone else, needing them in a way we can't return is bad, disgusting, a betrayal of that relationship, then we cannot return God's love. Now, in practice, those peer relationships, sometimes they will be even, right? Like sometimes I take care of my friend and they take care of me and we wind up basically even, and that's fine. But I think it's important to acknowledge that it's okay and normal for those relationships to be asymmetrical. Maybe I'm doing 80% of the caring in this relationship. My friend is doing 20%, and that's fine, right? The relationship of parent to child is hierarchical in that way because, or at least I'd say asymmetrical, right? Because the parent is doing things for the child that only a parent can do for a child. And even when your child cares for you when you are old, it doesn't really make sense to say, like, have I changed exactly as many diapers for my mother as she did for me? And if I did, are we even? If she needed something different from me than I needed from her, are we even? I really want to move away from that question of, are we even, right? What we are given are fragile bodies that call out for love from others. And what we are given are certain capacities that allow us to answer that call. And that proportion for each of us of how much we are calling out, asking for love, and how much we are offering things we've received in order to answer that call will vary. But I think none of us should worry too much about balancing the books. We should worry about doing both emphatically.
Thank you.
There were so many, as I was, not paging through literally because I don't have a physical copy of the book yet, but just so many delightful parts. And I love that you're getting into, disability, our neediness, people's practical resistance to just like being needy particularly as adults, and inviting other people into that vulnerability. And you also had you started getting into, I'm trying to find the quote that I had found, and your chapter on the limits of labor language, and really getting at how do we think about capital, money, and the economy versus this economy of care. And what were some of those things that you brought up in that chapter, and the both value of starting to like put the fiscal economy in conversation with this more invisible economy of care, and what are some of the dangers there?
So kind of like we're just talking about, I'm not against money and I'm not against jobs and care work, but I think part of what people are looking for when they look for care that's mediated by professionalism or by money is the sense of I can be equal to the person caring for me, or at least I can't be less than or needy to them. Because since I am paying you, we are even. We've both come up with something that's mutually agreeable. And to some extent, it allows me to hold you as a stranger, right? Or maybe I even feel like I'm in the superior position because I am paying. And when we ask someone, will you care for me? We put ourselves in the needy position. And I think it's important that even if you have the funds to kind of meet all your needs in that way, it's good to sometimes ask for people to care for you without recompense, partly just to remind yourself that you are lovable, right? That people don't always need a counterbalance in order to care. I think, again, because when you have this kind of work done for wages, it can kind of get captured by market logic, right? Where it's, okay, well, how can I justify a wage being paid for this? How can I justify, and to whom can I justify it? You'll run into weird parts in our law where parents can be paid for some of the care they give a severely disabled child, but not different parts. You're actually kind of, one of the moms I talk about is clocking in and out of caring for her son. Now, she's caring for him all day, but parts of the work count as work and parts don't. And it's odd. Like it's a sort of lie she participates in every day because of how we manage the accounting. You'll see attempts to kind of justify valuing care in terms of, well, how can I reframe this care in terms of money? And there's this project I really like on net by a writer for the Washington Post, Alyssa Rosenberg, that's about just mapping out how much time she spent breastfeeding. It's this great visual, and you see, like, not only is it a lot of time, it's speckled all throughout your day. So you can't be like, oh, well, I spend 2 hours a day breastfeeding, so I'll do that in the afternoon, and I'll have the whole morning to myself. It doesn't work that way. It's just, you might be breastfeeding at any moment. It's very interrupty. I love all that. And then I'm reading the article. I love the graphics. I get to this kind of record scratch of, so if I were paid for this work at this hourly rate, breastfeeding would be worth blank. I'm like, what? What does any of that have to do with what the whole rest of the article is about? And I understand why she did it, because she's kind of making sure that for each reader, there's something in it that's legible to them, and saying, okay, like if this were a job, or if it were the cost of formula instead, how can I quantify that the mom's love for her baby is worth something without having to get all touchy-feely about it? But it's crazy, right? Like the value of my breastfeeding is definitely not the opportunity cost of my foregone wages. It's just a different thing altogether. I think even people who are allies will kind of fall into this trap of, I have to find a way of explaining why this is worthwhile, that winds up kind of breaking the logic of what they're arguing for.
Yeah, I found it just really compelling and helpful to think about the way that money is often used to keep relationships at a distance and keep that kind of stranger relationship, not let it get too intimate, but it's just like you can't live your whole life that way. Like there are times where you need intimate help. And I think so much of the community that God's heart longs for is one that's intimate. It's one where it's that agapic love that's moving us into deeper relationship with one another. And so if we build so much of our life off of just thinking about the kind of financial relationships, we might be, I wonder if it's a little bit why Jesus said, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Well, and when you go back to the church fathers, there's a sermon, I think, from St. Augustine, where he talks about, what a mercy it is for the rich that there are poor, right? Because the poor are in material danger, which is not perilous to your soul in and of itself. But the rich are in danger of their soul, and but for the need of the poor, they might be damned. But it's the need of others that calls us out of ourself and forces us to, remind ourselves, like, I am a steward of the gifts I've been given, whether it's physical capacity, money, anything else, leisure time. And none of this is meant solely for me. And if I hang on to the idea it's meant solely for me, or making a gift for myself feel blocked. I have a chapter, specifically on men here. And I think often there the challenge is men are stronger on average, have less of their life that's marked by the kind of intense physical care that women are through pregnancy. So they have this excess of strength that I think many men know is meant for someone other than just themselves, right? Like you aren't given these muscles just for gym pics, and people know that. It's frustrating to have it turned in on itself or just about perfecting it in the abstract if you never pick up something heavy for someone else. And I think that's the real challenge, that each of us is meant to make a gift of our lives to others. And we rely on other people making a gift of their needs to us so that we might find out where we're asked to serve.
Mhm. A final question that I have is kind of more in this theological realm regarding gender. And I've been thinking for a while, a lot of, as our culture just gets very uncomfortable with various things around gender and how that, especially how that might look in some of the Bible's use of language, or even God being seen as father. And in the Protestant church, there's not as much emphasis on the church as bride, the church as kind of this feminine character. And I've wondered if we took a bit more pride in the church as she, if we would feel a bit more, I guess, just joy stepping into this drama of gender in the theological landscape. And I'm curious as how that intersects your work here as a feminist manifesto. Towards the end of your book, you say, we cannot build a just society on a false anthropology of independence. We cannot have a feminism that does not begin with recognizing and rejoicing in the embodied difference between men and women's greater exposure to dependence. I expect that that's a little controversial to be seeing that as a kind of a beginning point for rejoicing in femininity as a greater exposure to dependence. How how do you wrestle with that maybe controversial point? And then does that play into this understanding as church as feminine?
Yeah, so if we're going to go back to the intellectual underpinnings here, I think part of how I think about that is Charles Taylor's discussion of the porous self versus the buffered self. Are we someone who's basically open to and exposed to the world, or someone who's got a certain amount of safety and then chooses when to go out to the world? When he talks about this as kind of a modern versus pre-modern division, but I think there's a real gendered asymmetry to it, that women are obviously more porous to the world insofar as our bodies can suddenly have another person in them, and that it's not just as a matter of I will there to be a baby. The baby can come without you willing as long as you do the things that make children, right? And so, you have this sense of being a little more at the mercy of the world. I think again that's true for everyone. Like men can feel more buffered, but the reality of the world is that the world is there, that the world is not just there for us to encounter on our own schedule or by our own will, but kind of both recognizing the undeniable porosity of women's lives, then asking, okay, well, how do I take that as an invitation and not a threat? And how can women's example of that make it easier for men to recognize where their lives are genuinely unbuffered? Everyone is exposed to both hazard and to grace. And where are they kind of closing channels of grace for the sake of greater control that they might want to fling open? Now, when it comes to that theology of men and women and the church and Christ, I think this is also what's important for kind of making being open to chance worth it, right? Because would it be good to be a porous person in a purely pagan world? No. No, it certainly wouldn't. A world that's just full of spirits and forces is not a world you want to open yourself up to. It is a world where, like, the more buffer you can get, the better. The reason it is good and glorious to be porous in the world that God has made is it is made by our author who loves us for our good. Is it touched by original sin? Yes. But God's fundamental work in the world is good, and he is always loading the odds in our favor. So it is good to be exposed to the real world as he has made it, because it allows us to have better than we would ask for ourselves. That you don't get there without that real sense of, not only am I exposed to others, and I have to reconcile to that myself with that as a brute fact, but it is good that I am. And God, through the image of Christ in his church, has raised marriage to a sacrament, right? So marriage is no longer just a thing men and women negotiate across the sexes purely to each other. It is always something that's pointing at what God wants for us in the fullness of time eschatologically. And that's a lot more to work with and to get you through hard times than just, well, we're doing the best we can for each other.
DJ, do you have any final thoughts or questions?
I really appreciate this work, and I hope to engage more. And I hope more of our listeners will engage it as well. I think too few Christians are actually engaging it right now. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, with my kind of desire to see neighborhood community, Christian community deepen and be enriched. I find so much of this, the practical buffers, is on this very existential battle around, am I going to let people into my needs? Am I going to be honest about my neediness? So I deeply appreciate this work and its far-stretching implications.
Well, I'll just say to close, that's why I really encourage people in the book, and whenever I talk to them, like right now, please, make your first step into this by asking for help, not by reading my book and going, Leah's right. It's so important we acknowledge people need stuff. I'm going to look for someone who needs stuff so I can take care of them, because that is good. I'm not discouraging you from doing that, but it does a lot less to catechize your friend that you don't find need disgusting. But when you ask for help, they get to help you, and they learn that you, David, and you, TJ, are someone who thinks it is normal to ask other people for help. And now they may come back to you in the moment when they themselves need help.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank
Maybe
you.
on that note, I will say, listeners, if you've come this far, our podcast actually does need help. You're welcome to join our Substack support crew to keep this work going. Or if you have special skills and want to help out with things like Instagram or help develop writings, we're interested in people joining the team because it's a labor of love. Leah, what are ways that people might follow up with you or learn more about your works?
I think the easiest way is my Substack, Other Feminisms. Make sure you hear that S and rowdy diversity of opinions, feminisms.com. And you can find the book, The Dignity of Dependence, at all major online booksellers. And if you hassle them, you'll probably find it at your local bookseller or library as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, it's a really great work, y'all. Thank you again, Leah. Yeah, everybody have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at. Bye-bye.
If you like this podcast and want to see it continue, we have news. We are transitioning to Substack's paid subscription model. Starting at $5 a month, you can ensure that this podcast continues, and you'll also get access to our subscriber-only WhatsApp group for new Kinship supporters. This podcast is fully supported by people like you who want to see it continue. And on that note, if you like the new Kinship podcast, one of the best ways you can support it is by sharing it with someone else who might like it. The more the merrier.